Welcome to another episode of the Bible Feed podcast. I'm Dan Weatherall and I'm here with Paul Davenport, and we're going to be looking at another of our Bible book overviews, our introductions to a Bible book, where we take one of the books of the Bible and summarise it in 45 minutes-ish. And today it's the book of Judges. So we're diving into a really fascinating part of the Bible. Fascinating, but also complex. And honestly, there's some quite disturbing parts of this book, which we're going to be thinking about. But nonetheless, if you're intrigued by tales of heroism and moral collapse, and of course the unrelenting patience of God, it's all here in the book of Judges.
Hi Dan, and this book of Judges follows right after the book of Joshua, which again has got some challenges to deal with, and really the book of Judges just picks up the story of Israel from where we left off at the end of the book of Joshua. And actually you led us through that introduction to the book of Joshua, didn't you?
Yeah, so Joshua is about the entry of the people of Israel into the land of Canaan, isn't it? The last few books, as part of the Torah, the Pentateuch, Moses has been leading the people of Israel out of Egypt, through the wilderness, into the edge of the promised land. And then Joshua is that moment when they cross into the land and they take Jericho, the city, Canaanite city there. They take many other cities, and there's the controversial and difficult sections of Joshua where it seems to be describing a pretty brutal campaign of annihilation of Canaanites being wiped out, full families and everything. So we dealt with that, didn't we? Do you think?
Yeah, I think there was some fair consideration of the different things that might be going on in the text there, in some complex narratives there. So as we go into Judges, it's an equally messy and tumultuous period that, you go from the beginning of the book of Judges to the end of the book of Judges, and you don't feel like you've moved from point A in history to point B, kind of different outcome, different situation. There's some really big stories, some big characters, larger than life, extraordinary characters in there. But it's there kind of in the Old Testament, maybe a little bit obscure. And I just wonder what people generally might know about the book of Judges. As I was leaving work today, I was saying I was going to record a podcast about the book of Judges to some of my colleagues. And one of them said, "That's in the Old Testament, isn't it?" So that was good.
That's a good start.
But what else do you think people might know?
Yeah, it can be a little bit obscure part of the Bible, can't it? Because of the crazy things that go on. But I think probably people will know about Gideon and the fleece. That's probably one of the most well-known stories there, where Gideon puts a fleece out and asks for a sign, and he then ends up smashing jars with flaming torches in them to defeat the Midianites. So, maybe people know a bit about that. Samson's a character, I think, strength of Samson. Yeah. What's the all
that glitters is not gold? Oh, no, that's Lord of the Rings.
That's not that one. It's killing the lion and having out of the carcass of the lion, the honey that's pulled from it. There's a brand, isn't there? A brand of honey that has that on the jar.
Oh, really?
There is, yeah. It might have. I think recently it might have been taken away. But yeah, maybe there's a few things like that people might know. I mean, maybe even like the tent peg, Jael's tent peg through Sisera. That's pretty gruesome detail.
That's a fairly brutal way for somebody to be finished off. Yeah, but I don't know whether people really kind of aware of these characters in the book of Judges, but I think there's one really obscure thing in the book of Judges that more people are aware of.
Okay.
Well, they may not know it comes from the book of Judges, but it's this idea of shibboleth. And this comes from, I think it's in Jephthah's period when he was one of the judges. And there'd been a conflict between two of the tribes, and one of them had taken a pass, and the others were trying to get back. The password, if you like, was to say shibboleth. And that particular tribe couldn't say. They had an accent, a regional accent, which meant they couldn't say shibboleth. They said sibboleth. And that's kind of passed into general use as almost like a password. And in fact, I heard somebody talking about this on the radio only last week.
Oh, brilliant.
Because of a study that has been done to show that in the UK, the Welsh and the Scottish are the best regional accents for spotting if someone's faking their accent.
There we are,
so
see?
This example of shibboleth was used. So
right you are then.
So I think that's, so that's definitely fake.
Okay, well done.
So So I reckon, even though people may not know that it's come from the Book of Judges, and there's all sorts of things like that have come from the Bible that may have passed into general use. But there's a whole lot more to uncover in the Book of Judges, in the way it's structured, and there are some of its darker, lesser-known sections. Yeah,
and that's what our aim is, isn't it? To just step back, think of it as a whole, this book as a whole, and what's it trying to achieve. And we'll get into some of the detail as well. But we're also going to try and throw in a bonus. We're going to look at the Book of Ruth a little bit at the end as well. It's set in the time of the Judges, so the same time period, but offers a completely different type of story, which is a welcome contrast. So let's get into this book then, the Book of Judges. How does it start? How does it pick up from the Book of Joshua?
Well, it's actually quite simple in terms of the way it's structured. It's got 3 sections, and the first 2 chapters are a sort of introductory, setting the scene, setting the context, and then there's chapters 3 through to 16, which go through a series of cycles of events that happen in the lives of certain judges or rulers in Israel. And then there's chapters 17 to the end, to chapter 21, which is a really gnarly, weird and a bit nasty section with the things that are going on in that section, which then close off the book. And it is a period of historical transition. And then for Israel, they'd entered the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership, but things didn't quite go as planned.
Yeah, so Joshua ends with Israel failing to occupy the land, doesn't it? As we saw in the last episode, instead of driving out all the Canaanites, they are settled among them. So this situation is the way Judges starts, isn't it? Exploring what happens after this, the consequences of that kind of compromise.
Yeah, so it wasn't just the people of Israel that were in this kind of state of flux at this time, because this was a shift from the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age, into the early Iron Age. So it's a technological revolution, and it has been likened to the impact as equivalent to the dawn of the internet age, and it's that kind of change of technology. I'm not quite sure the analogy works that well, but you come across peoples like the Philistines in this period, and they've migrated from island and coastal regions around the Mediterranean to the west coast of what is now Israel, Palestine, Gaza Strip, that kind of area. But they brought iron weapons and chariots to the region, and that gives them an instant military advantage. So that kind of just changes the whole dynamic of peoples that were established and strong. Suddenly they're out of date technologically, and so they start to fall. Like the Hittites were a people up in the more northern region that were strong, but they fell, they crumbled in this.
And at the same time, you have prosperous sort of city-states, don't you? Like Ugarit in northern Syria, a Bronze Age settlement, but it doesn't really adapt, and it falls to those migrating sea peoples. Yeah. And what's really, there's a vast array of texts that have been found from Ugarit, aren't there? So, and there's a lot that have to do with Baal or Baal or however it would have been pronounced. Yeah. The Baal cycle that confirm the nature of Baal worship and things like that. And that, if you understand a little bit of that background as well, you'll see a lot of that in the struggles that Israel have throughout the period of the Judges and the worship of Baal.
Yeah, it's incredibly valuable, those texts that have been found that just open a window on the cultural environment of this period, in which Israel were struggling with keeping to this covenant relationship with their God. And actually that's sort of how the scene is set in these first couple of chapters of Judges. So we finish at the end of Joshua with not quite taken the land, haven't kind of followed through. And we see some attempts to continue that. There's Judah and there's Simeon, and it appears like they're being successful. But over and over again, as the chapter 1 continues, we get a phrase such as verse 21, "But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem." And then again in verse 27, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants. Then verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the inhabitants. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants. Naphtali, and so on. You get the picture. It doesn't quite go through all of the different tribes in Israel, all the 12 tribes. And by chapter 2, the conclusion is that Israel have broken their covenant with God. So at the beginning of chapter 2, it just recalls how God declares when he brings Israel out of Egypt, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. So it was to be that kind of relationship. But then continues, you have not obeyed my voice. And so by the end of chapter 2, we get into this cycle of failure. And I think it's just worth emphasizing the importance of the concept of this covenant, because we probably don't really get fully what a covenant in the ancient world really means. We perhaps might think of it as an agreement or a contract. If you and I, Dan, have a contract, it's probably going to go along the lines of, I will give you this and you will give me that.
Maybe.
But that's not a covenant. A covenant is more like, I am yours and you are mine. It's a much deeper relationship. And we perhaps miss that a bit. The covenant for Israel is rooted in the promises to Abraham. Maybe it's worth just looking at a couple of descriptions of the covenant in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 7. Moses here tells the people, it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you. You were the fewest of all peoples. It is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers. So that's Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And I'm sure if you remember back to the Genesis episode that we did, one of those promises to Abraham was that in him all nations were to be blessed. And so the really key thing about this covenant, I think, that is helpful to set it in its context is that it wasn't just to be this exclusive relationship between God and this people Israel. It was intended to be more than that. So in Exodus 19, when Moses is on one of his trips up the Mount Sinai, Moses went up to God and God called to him out of the mountain saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So the point is, God wants this relationship with the nation, but the purpose of it is to effectively act as a go-between, a mediator to other nations, to spread the principles and values of God out to other nations. And by sitting there next to and compromising with the inhabitants of the land, that fails to achieve what that covenant is intended to achieve. And so that chapter 2 of Judges finishes with a sort of general description that Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord, they abandon the Lord, and then they are plundered by one of the surrounding peoples. They're oppressed, plundered by them. They appeal for help, and then God raises up a deliverer. They're delivered, and then they go back down the cycle again and depart and abandon God, and it all goes round in a repeating cycle.
Yeah, and these cycles, they're a really distinctive feature of this book, aren't they? And it's really great to spot them and to notice this same thing happening again and again. So, verse 17 of chapter 2, yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked. Verse 18, whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge. He saved them from the hand of their enemies. But then, verse 19, whenever the judge died, they turned back. And it seems to just go round and round in circles, this sort of tragic pattern. So those first 2 chapters then open up, set the scene, tell you what's going to happen in this cycle, this pattern. And then we get that unfold, don't we? How do we explore these cycles then in the rest of the book?
We'll perhaps comment a little bit later about this thing about worshipping other gods versus the one true God and the relevance of that. But just as we go into chapter 3, we get the first judge that's introduced in chapter 3 and verse 7, and it almost follows the description of that general cycle. Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot their God. They served Baal. Therefore, they were oppressed by a particular king. When the people of Israel cried out, the Lord raised a deliverer. It was Othniel, and he went to war, and they were delivered. And it's almost formulaic. It's almost just following the same formula as that cycle that's described in chapter 2, but putting a name in for the judge. It's really short and formulaic, and that might, I think, be a hint that what we're going to be faced with here isn't just straightforward history of a sequence of events going through this period. Instead, we're probably dealing with something that is crafted and woven together to illustrate a particular point.
So something that's been assembled and thought about carefully rather than just chronologically necessarily going through. Okay, so that's useful. So Othniel, he doesn't get much airtime, does he? He's a fairly short one, but that cycle carries on, and we do get some bigger judges. Some are really have just a few verses, and then we get Deborah and Gideon, Jephthah and Samson. We've got really quite a few chapters, a handful of chapters, fully developed stories, plots and characters. So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's really those four that pop out. There's much more narrative devoted to those four: Deborah and Barak, Gideon, Jephthah and Samson. But actually in total there are 13 judges when we go through chapters 3 to 16. And I'm sure you're thinking, it'd be great if that was 12.
I am.
Yeah. And there's an interesting little twist here, because one of them is the son of Gideon, a guy called Abimelech. And he appointed himself, not as a judge, but actually as a king. And actually the criteria, wasn't it, in chapter 2 in this cycle was God would raise up the judge that would deliver them. So actually, I think you can strike him out and say he's not really in the list of judges. So that would leave us with 12 judges. So that we've got 12 tribes of Israel. And, there's not one from each tribe. It doesn't work like that. But there's 12, almost mirroring the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah, so that's another point in the favour of imagining or thinking that this book has been deliberately compiled and structured in this way. There may have been other kind of leaders at this time that haven't been included. Here's 12 of them that are put together and arranged in this way. And
that even though it's not as neat as there's one from each tribe, it's probably telling us this is something that involves all the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
And actually, it's not just the tribes. When we look at those four main characters, the events of their lives don't involve the whole land. They're in particular regions, and there's one in a northern part of the land, one in the south, one in the east, and one in the west.
Okay.
So we've got that kind of regional factor from those four main characters as well.
Okay. So each of the big stories aren't necessarily covering the whole land of Israel as we'd know it now. They're events that happen in a region. However, we've got a north, south, east and west story, effectively. Yeah. So that's really interesting, isn't it? So they're not a coherent nation as it kind of will become, not necessarily fully under Saul, but under David and Solomon as kings. But the record here in Judges is definitely then grouping them together. All of these tribes have entered into this covenant. That's part of what the other books leading up to Judges have been about. So they're all part of that. And all this same cycle of sin and oppression and deliverance is happening to them all.
And actually, when we think of that cycle, and you start to think more broadly about the biblical story, it isn't really just confined to Judges. This isn't just a feature of Judges. That pattern continues into Israel's history, even when they are one coherent nation under kings. There are very much cycles of decline into moral failure, and then one of the kings arises to lead them and to reform them and bring them back and to renew the covenant. There's kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, reforming kings who bring the nation back to God after a period of moral decline.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, taking a step back, the same pattern of this sin and decline, sin and oppression is just seen in the whole sweep of Israel's history, isn't it? They decline, they're exiled, and then they're restored as well to the land. It's the same thing that's happening to them, which arguably is portrayed as happening to the whole human race when we get the kind of paradigm story of human sin, Adam and Eve exiled from the garden, and then the whole thing is to be restored back. So yeah, it's this cycle that is affecting these little tribes here, but also affecting the whole nation, but also affecting all of humanity. So when is this cycle ever going to end? What's going to finally break it? That's the big question.
Yeah, maybe we can just explore those four characters a little bit more and dive into them. We've talked about Deborah and Barak, and they're in the northern region. As the Canaanites were the problem for them. But you have this unexpected situation in which Barak says, I can't lead the people in this deliverance. And it turns to this woman, Deborah, to really be the driving force. And that's really unexpected in the kind of culture of that time that should be the case. So they're in the north. Gideon is more located in the south, and the Midianites were the problem for the people in that region. And Gideon is chosen to lead the people, but he almost seems to repeatedly want some sign from God to show that he is with him. And that's where there is this fleece test. He lays a fleece out on the ground and says, if you're with me, then let there be dew on the fleece in the morning, but the ground around it be dry. And that happens. And then, I'm still not quite sure. And so tomorrow night, I'm going to put the fleece down again, and I want the fleece to be dry and the ground wet. And then the next morning, that's the case. So there seems to be this doubt, but God works with him and through him. But then towards the end of his life, he takes some of the spoil from the deliverance and makes an ephod, and that becomes an object of worship in itself. So there's that flaw in Gideon. So that's two of them. The third one is Jephthah, and he's on the eastern side of Jordan, the region known as Gilead. The Ammonites were their problem. And the thing that people might remember about Jephthah is that before he went out to the battle, he said, when I come back victorious, the first thing that comes out of my house, I will sacrifice as a burnt offering to God.
Yep.
And he comes home, and it's his daughter that comes out. And you think, was that a wise vow? And so there's all sorts of debate about what actually happened then with Jephthah's daughter, which we won't go into.
Yeah, no, sure. And so Jephthah's the one with the accent, the story with that. It's interesting. We've talked of the Northerners, haven't we? With the hardy Northern women who would drive tent pegs through the temples. That's in the story of Deborah and Barak, and then the dithering Southerners like Gideon. So it's some interesting analogies we could draw. And then Jephthah in the East. Okay, so who's that? Next?
He's an Essex boy or something?
Probably,
I don't know. I'm not quite sure. We should go too far with this.
Probably not.
We're becoming very, very UK-centric.
That's right, yeah.
And now we're going to the West Country with Samson and the Philistines over in the West. And Samson has, all of the sort of escapades that he gets involved in seem to involve his relationship with women, and there's Delilah who seduces him, and his hair's cut, and he loses his strength for a time. What I guess we get from those four main characters is, they're not kind of crisp, clean superhero characters.
No.
They're really complex. They leave you with lots to think about as to what kind of a person is this. And they're complex characters with multiple kind of sides and aspects to them. And yet they're all mentioned in some form in the New Testament, in a chapter which is all about people of faith, in Hebrews chapter 11. So it says there, and what more shall I say, as the writer's gone through a long list of faithful people and the things that they have done as evidence of their faith. And it says, what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and so on. So those four key people, it's Barak rather than Deborah, but those four main stories in Judges are all mentioned there. So we've got these complex characters, but they're all commended as examples of faith. So that's something to think about.
The other thing as well, we sort of can laugh and joke about the north and south and east and west, different characteristics and so on. And I'm sure, if you listen in the US, you could think about your southerners and the east coast and the west coast elites or whatever, and all those kind of stereotypes. But actually, the fact that Judges does this and groups all these different tribes clearly with different accents and clearly with slightly different quirks to their sort of tribal heritage, and yet they're all here part of this covenant. And they're all flawed human beings, and they're all breaking the covenant. The people who these judges represent have broken the covenant. And yet, through all of this, God is prepared to always continually deliver. So it is pretty remarkable, I think, a good way of showing how that God is working through imperfection. God is continually working through imperfect human beings. And that's a good news story, isn't it, I think, for for the rest of us.
And maybe even though we are flawed, there's something that God sees, which is a willingness to commit to trusting in God. Even though decisions and approaches to situations may be flawed, that's something that God can work with.
Yeah, and the faith is the allegiance, isn't it? It's the trust and the loyalty that someone might show despite their failings and particular flaws at a particular time. But life and humanity is complex, and therefore we can still be people of faith despite having messed up like most other people, like every other person. Okay, right. So we've got those cycles that we've gone through, those 13 but not really 13, 12 judges, the 4 particular stories that we've thought a little bit about. But then you get to this final section. What are we going to do with that then, Paul?
Yeah, so after these 12 cycles of almost an epitome of this period, encompassing 12 tribes and all regions, north, south, east and west, as if that wasn't bad enough in terms of those cycles, these final chapters of Judges take us into some of the darkest depths of Israel's moral decline and collapse. And it's actually really hard to read. And it's like the chapters that must not be named. It's you almost just want to avoid them. Let's not read those.
Yeah.
Let's just move on from that.
Yeah, so we've got idolatry, haven't we? Taking idols and house shrines and stealing priests and all sorts. It's self-appointed priests, in fact. Yeah. But then you turn quite quickly into sort of really horrific and brutal acts of rape and murder that then escalates into civil war. And at the end of these horrific chapters, one of the tribes, the tribe of Benjamin, is almost wiped out completely, which is bearing in mind, we've started with the connection to the book of Joshua, where they kind of failed to wipe out the non-covenant people, the people who wouldn't join the covenant. And they've now, at the end of this book, they're pretty much almost wiping out one of the covenant tribes.
And then it closes with a really quite bizarre story of, it says it's a feast of the Lord, but it's not like any other feasts in the law. It involves the virgins from the tribes running through the vineyards, and the Benjamites that are almost wiped out snatch the virgins from the vineyards, in the midst of this, what I assume is something more like a pagan fertility festival. And really, the whole thing then finishes. The whole book of Judges finishes.
And they all lived happily ever after. Is that what it is?
Well, it doesn't finish quite like that. So the final verse of Judges is, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that really sums up what we've got to. It's almost saying these practices, the idolatry and the power struggles of self-appointed priests and regional rulers, and then the terrible atrocities that are done, really is just sort of to demonstrate that Israel, these disparate tribes of Israel, have now really become no different from the Canaanites that were there in the land before they got there. And sometimes it can seem like when God is being so insistent on stay faithful to me and worship me only and don't worship these other idols, you think, oh, that's just God being a bit jealous and not letting people do what they want. The reality is that departure from that covenant involves going into moral decline. So that it starts with idolatry, but it finishes with rape, murder, civil war, and absolute atrocities. So that immorality and atrocious behaviour is the result of departure from the covenant with God. So that, as part of the reason why this is perhaps so shocking to read, is the point is departure from this covenant that God wants to establish with human beings leads you only into moral decline.
Yeah, and that's the point of this section, isn't it? It's quite striking, actually, these last couple of stories in this last section. There's not really any timing, is there? There's a couple of clues that possibly might put these stories towards the beginning of the period of the Judges. That may be the case or not. So if that's the case, they're kind of out of order, but that shows they've just been put here specifically to show that, this is the result. This is what the period is like. That everyone, the people of Israel, are doing what is right in their own eyes. They're no better. So that's kind of the cliffhanger then. That's how it ends. Yeah. I suppose are they going to face the same judgment? Are they going to be wiped out, driven out the land? Is that what is going to happen? And then in comes the book of Ruth. When everyone is discouraged and depressed and despondent, the book of Ruth comes in specifically in the days when the judges ruled. There was a famine in the land. That's how it starts. So this book offers a very different perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's interesting that it should be a book now, 4 chapters, about Ruth, who is not an Israelite. She's a Moabite woman. She is in Moab, and there's a family from Israel who leave because of the famine to go to Moab for food, presumably. And Ruth is married to one of the sons in this family, who then dies. But then Ruth chooses to follow her mother-in-law, Naomi, back to Israel and commits to following God. So she says, don't urge me to go back. When she's coming back with Naomi. She says, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. So there's this kind of commitment from this Moabite woman. And so she moves back to Bethlehem, and that's where she meets this man called Boaz, a man of standing and integrity. And then it becomes a love story, and they become married. But here we have tagged onto this really dark period a woman like Rahab, from outside the covenant, who is willingly committing to it.
Yeah, just a tiny little detail that I remember from the book of Ruth as well is that she goes out into the field, doesn't she, to glean, to pick up all the bits of corn that are dropped. And Boaz, a man of real integrity, is really insistent that she's safe when she goes out in the field, which, as we've seen, when young ladies go out into fields, they're liable to be stolen by young Benjamites, as we just literally had that kind of story in our minds. And yet she is looked after, and the young men are commanded not to touch her, and so on. So there's this little oasis of integrity in this period of terrible darkness. And the amazing thing is that at the end of this book, it turns out, the great big twist at the end of the book of Ruth, is that she is the great-grandmother of King David. And of course, that makes her in the line of Jesus, an ancestor of Jesus. So a massive, amazing story that even in the darkest of moments in history, God is working. God is furthering a plan and a purpose.
And in the book of Ruth, actually, God isn't referred to very much. It doesn't say anything at all, really, about God did this, God did that. It's all about the personal choices of his family, first of all, to move out of Israel to Moab, and then Ruth to put her trust in the God of Israel and to go with Naomi back to Bethlehem, and their plans that they make. And it's all about their personal decisions and choices. But it leads to God's purpose moving forward with King David, and then ultimately the line down to Jesus. And it must also be a deliberate contrast with, in Judges, this cycle of failure in Israel generally, compared with Ruth, a non-Israelite, and her faith. So while Israel was struggling to keep that covenant, this outsider chose to embrace it fully.
Yeah, and she's mentioned because of this in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 1, which I know we've referred to at least once in the podcast, maybe a few times. So her story, some bright light from the dark period of the Judges, ties into this big picture of God's redemption of Israel and of the whole world, all the nations as well, that God is trying to redeem. That big picture of redemption that we'll explore more in our upcoming Christmas episode.
Yeah, so maybe just to wrap up, Judges is a pretty sobering book at times, and it certainly demonstrates the consequences of disobedience, idolatry, breaking a covenant with God, a covenant that was designed to bring God to the world, and so it can't be taken lightly. But it also points us to God's patience in continuing to work with his people through most unexpected means to move his ultimate plan for redemption forward in a way which leads to Jesus.
Yeah, which is seen through the book of Ruth, bringing God's grace even in these terrible times. Thanks for that, Paul. I think the book of Judges also tells us to look out for regional dialects and accents. I think that's the one takeaway that I've had. Always to look out for that and enjoy that as much as possible.
Particularly fake ones.
And exactly. So thank you very much for that. Another really fascinating look into one of these little books of the Old Testament, which sometimes can be ignored because they're difficult or they've got difficult content, but actually they sit inside that story, they sit inside that whole narrative and framework. They're really helpful for us all and to get that holistic view of God's word and God's message. So hopefully that's been helpful to you. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to catch us next time. Subscribe to us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Check us out on social media and at biblefeed.org. And until next time, we'll see you again.